The early October dawn crept across the Alaskan wilderness with reluctant fingers of pale light, barely penetrating the dense canopy of spruce and hemlock trees. Frost clung to every surface, transforming the forest into a crystalline cathedral. The air hung still and heavy, carrying the metallic scent of approaching snow, though the forecast had predicted clear skies for the next 3 days. The hunter moved with practiced silence through the underbrush, each step calculated and precise. At 47, his body still responded with the efficiency that 2 decades in these woods had demanded. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into countless sunrises, tracking game across miles of unforgiving terrain. His beard, more salt than pepper now, had grown fuller since the hunting season began 6 weeks ago. This was his 19th season guiding in this particular stretch of wilderness, a remote area approximately 60 miles from the nearest settlement. The locals respected him, not for any particular warmth of character, but for his unerring knowledge of the land and its rhythms. When younger guides boasted of their kills, he remained silent, knowing that true mastery of these woods required something beyond skill with a rifle. The weight of the pack against his shoulders was comforting, familiar. Inside were the essentials: additional ammunition for the Winchester, .30-06 slung across his back, field dressing kit, emergency medical supplies, water purification tablets, high-calorie rations, satellite phone, GPS unit, and the thermos of black coffee his daughter had prepared before he left the cabin that morning. The coffee was a ritual they shared. She would rise before him just to ensure it was ready, despite his insistence that, at 17, she deserved more sleep. His wife had never understood this part of him, the need for solitude, for communion with the wilderness. The divorce had been finalized 5 years ago, but his daughter had chosen to remain with him in Alaska, attending the local school while helping with his guide business. She handled the books, the scheduling, the client communications. She was the voice when he preferred silence. In her, he saw the same quiet strength that had drawn him to these woods decades ago. The hunter paused, dropping to one knee beside a fallen log. Something was off today. The forest felt different, though he couldn't immediately identify why. He closed his eyes, letting his senses extend beyond the visual. The birds. There were no birds calling. This time of year, even with the approaching winter, the jays and ravens should be active, complaining about the cold. But the silence was complete, oppressive. He opened his eyes, scanning the forest floor. No signs of recent animal movement, no droppings, no disturbed undergrowth beyond his own trail. Even the squirrels seemed to have abandoned this section of the woods. In 19 years, he'd never seen the area so devoid of life. Rising to his feet, the hunter adjusted his course slightly eastward. He had planned to check the ridge overlooking the valley where moose typically grazed during the early morning hours, but something pulled him toward a small clearing he knew lay about a half-mile ahead. Perhaps there he would find signs explaining the unnatural quiet. As he walked, his mind drifted to the client scheduled to arrive next week, a corporate executive from Chicago who'd paid premium rates for a late-season hunt. The man had been explicit in his desire for a trophy bull moose, something to display in his downtown office. The hunter had no particular affection for this type of client, but the money would help cover his daughter's college applications. She had her sights set on environmental science programs in the lower 48, and while part of him mourned the inevitable separation, another part swelled with pride at her ambitions. The air grew colder as he approached the clearing, though the sun had risen higher, bathing the forest in pale golden light. His breath formed clouds before his face, unusual for this time of day, even in October. He'd checked the weather report just yesterday. Temperatures were supposed to remain steady, no significant drops predicted. The first indication that something was truly wrong came from his hunting dog, a 5-year-old chocolate lab named for its unusual amber eyes. The dog had been ranging ahead, nose to the ground, but now stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from its throat. "What is it, boy?" the hunter whispered, immediately dropping into a crouch and bringing his rifle to a ready position. The dog didn't respond to his voice. Another anomaly. Years of training had made the animal responsive to the slightest command. Now it stood rigid, eyes fixed on something in the clearing beyond. The hunter advanced slowly, every sense heightened. The silence seemed to press against his eardrums, broken only by the sound of his heartbeat and the soft crunch of frost beneath his boots. The clearing appeared empty at first glance, Just a roughly circular space about 30 yards across, ringed by ancient spruce trees. But the dog wouldn't move forward, wouldn't even look back at its master. And then the hunter noticed something unusual in the ground at the center of the clearing, a patch where the frost pattern differed from the surrounding area. The earth there looked disturbed. The hunter approached the center of the clearing with measured steps, rifle still at the ready. 19 years in these woods had taught him caution. Bears were common, and though most had begun preparing for hibernation, a hungry or injured animal could be unpredictable. But something told him that whatever had disturbed the earth wasn't animal in nature. The patch of ground measured roughly 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. The frost covered it unevenly, suggesting the soil had been disturbed recently, perhaps within the last day or two. In the dim morning light, he could make out what appeared to be shallow depressions around the perimeter, as though someone had knelt there. The hunter set his rifle carefully against a fallen log and removed his pack, extracting a small, collapsible shovel he carried for emergency shelter construction. The dog remained at the edge of the clearing, refusing to approach despite several commands. This alone was enough to raise the hunter's concern to new heights. In all their years together, the animal had never disobeyed so blatantly. "Stay there, then," he muttered, turning his attention to the disturbed earth. The ground was hard with frost, but not yet frozen solid. The shovel bit into the soil with some resistance. 6 inches down, the earth became softer, as though it had been previously excavated. Whatever lay beneath had been buried recently enough that the ground hadn't fully settled. 12 inches down, the shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. Not the ring of metal on stone, but something different, a hollow sound. The hunter paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. His breath came faster now, fogging in the still air. The forest's silence seemed to intensify, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath. He cleared more earth away, revealing what appeared to be a flat, dark surface. Not natural, manufactured, synthetic. A container of some kind, buried deliberately in this remote clearing, miles from any road or trail. As more soil was scraped away, the dimensions became clearer, roughly the size of a large footlocker or small trunk. The material appeared to be high-grade polymer, black and unmarked. The hunter had encountered strange things in the wilderness before: abandoned equipment from mining operations, remnants of old hunting camps, even the occasional scientific research station. But this was different. The container had been buried with care, in a location that saw little human traffic, and recently, he worked methodically, clearing the earth from around the container's perimeter. No identifying markings were visible on the exposed surfaces. No manufacturer's logo, no shipping information, nothing to indicate its purpose or origin. Just smooth black polymer, undamaged by its time underground. When he had cleared enough soil to expose the top completely, the hunter noticed what appeared to be a sophisticated locking mechanism recessed into the surface. Not a simple latch or padlock, but something electronic. A small indicator light glowed green, suggesting the mechanism was powered and functional. His first instinct was to contact the authorities. Unexplained containers in remote wilderness locations rarely contained anything benign. But curiosity, the same instinct that had made him an effective hunter for decades, pushed against caution. The container was here, in his territory, potentially affecting the wildlife he depended on. The absence of animals, the dog's strange behavior, these might be connected to whatever lay inside. The lock appeared to have been tampered with. Small scratches surrounded the electronic panel, and closer inspection revealed that the mechanism had been compromised. With careful pressure applied to what seemed to be a release button, the top panel of the container shifted slightly with a soft hiss, suggesting an airtight seal had been broken. The hunter's heart pounded against his ribs as he used the edge of the shovel to lift the lid further. As it rose, a faint odor escaped, clinical, antiseptic, with an underlying note he couldn't immediately identify. Not decomposition, not quite chemical. Something wrong. Steeling himself, he pushed the lid fully open. The contents made his blood run cold. Inside the container, carefully arranged in molded compartments, were dozens of specimen jars. Each was labeled with scientific notation he didn't recognize, and contained what appeared to be biological samples suspended in clear liquid. But what froze him in place, what sent ice through his veins, were the specimens themselves. They weren't from any animal he recognized from nearly 2 decades in these woods. The proportions were wrong, limbs too long, features distorted in ways that defied natural evolution. In one jar, something that resembled a half-formed fetus of indeterminate species stared back with eyes too large, too aware for an unborn creature. In another, a preserved organ pulsed slowly, despite being separated from whatever body had once housed it. The hunter stumbled backward, nearly falling as his boots caught in the excavated soil. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, visible in the cold air. The rifle lay forgotten against the log as he struggled to process what he was seeing. In all his years in the wilderness, through blizzards and encounters with predators, he had never felt the primal fear that now gripped him. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the specimens themselves, but their obvious scientific cataloging. This wasn't the work of amateurs or criminals. The precision of the preservation, the careful labeling, all suggested professional scientific methodology. But no legitimate research project would be buried in secret, miles from civilization. When his breathing steadied, the hunter approached the container again, forcing himself to look more carefully. Beyond the specimen jars lay several sealed document folders, marked with what appeared to be governmental or corporate logos, partially obscured by warning labels. A small electronic device nestled in one corner, its purpose unclear, and most troublingly, a stack of photographs showing what looked like surgical procedures performed on subjects he couldn't identify. The hunter withdrew his satellite phone from his pack, intending to document what he'd found before contacting authorities. As the camera on the phone flashed, capturing images of the container's contents, he noticed something he'd initially overlooked, a small rectangular object at the bottom of the container, a hard drive or data storage device of some kind, connected to what appeared to be a battery pack. This discovery was beyond his experience, beyond anything he had encountered in nearly 2 decades traversing these remote woods. Whatever he had stumbled upon, it was clearly meant to remain hidden. The question was, from whom? The hunter spent the next hour meticulously photographing the container and its contents. The satellite phone's camera wasn't ideal, but it would serve for documentation purposes. He was careful not to touch anything inside the container directly, using the handle of his knife to gently shift items for better visibility. As the initial shock subsided, his professional instincts took over. He began cataloging details that might prove important later: the exact GPS coordinates of the clearing, the condition of the soil around the container, footprints or other signs of human presence. He found several cigarette butts approximately 15 yards from the container. Unusual, as most experienced wilderness travelers practiced leave-no-trace principles. These weren't weathered. They couldn't have been there more than a few days. He also discovered what appeared to be boot prints leading away from the clearing toward the northwest, not the direction of the nearest road or settlement. The prints were partially obscured by frost, but still discernible to his trained eye. Size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern he didn't recognize. Not standard hunting boots or hiking gear, something more tactical in nature. Most concerning was a small area where the undergrowth had been flattened, as though someone had set up temporary camp. There he found a discarded protein bar wrapper with manufacturing information still legible. The expiration date printed on the wrapper was 3 weeks in the future. Whoever had been here had come prepared but hadn't been careful about covering their tracks, either due to haste or confidence that no one would find this remote location. The hunter returned to the container for a closer examination of the documents. Without touching them, he could see that some appeared to be research protocols, filled with technical terminology he didn't understand. Others looked like maps or survey documents of the surrounding wilderness area, marked with locations he'd never seen indicated on any official Forest Service maps. One folder was labeled Phase 2, with a series of dates spanning the coming month. After gathering as much information as he could, the hunter carefully replaced the container's lid, ensuring it sealed properly. He didn't rebury it. Evidence should remain undisturbed for the authorities, but he camouflaged it with fallen branches and forest debris, enough to prevent casual discovery by the rare hiker who might wander this far off trail, but not enough to suggest intentional concealment on his part. With the documentation secure on his satellite phone, the hunter hiked 3 miles to reach the minimal signal required for communication. The Regional Forest Service office was his first call. After navigating an automated system and waiting on hold for 11 minutes, he finally reached a human representative. "Forest Service, Division of Land Management. How can I direct your call?" The voice was female, brisk, professional. "This is..." The hunter caught himself before giving his name. some instinct for caution asserting itself. "I'm a licensed hunting guide operating in the eastern sector. I need to report a discovery of concern in the wilderness area." "What kind of discovery, sir?" The tone suggested this was a routine call, one of dozens received that day. "I found what appears to be a buried container with biological specimens and research materials. It was hidden deliberately in a remote clearing, approximately 60 miles from any access road." A pause. "Sir, are you reporting trash dumping in the wilderness area? I can transfer you to our environmental compliance office." The hunter's grip tightened on the phone. "This isn't trash dumping. I'm talking about what looks like scientific specimens, biological material preserved in jars, research documents, electronic equipment, all buried in a sealed container in one of the most remote sections of the wilderness." "I see." The representative's tone shifted slightly. "And you're certain these aren't materials from one of our wildlife monitoring stations? We do have several research projects operating in the eastern sector. These weren't Forest Service materials. There were no markings I recognized, and the specimens—" He hesitated, aware of how his next words might sound. "The specimens don't match any wildlife indigenous to this region, or any I've ever encountered in 20 years of hunting." Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, I'm going to transfer you to my supervisor. Please hold." 5 more minutes passed before a male voice came on the line. "This is Deputy Supervisor Wilkins. I understand you've reported finding some kind of research materials?" The hunter repeated his discovery, providing the GPS coordinates and describing the contents in as much detail as he could. He mentioned the photographs stored on his satellite phone and offered to send them once he returned to an area with better connectivity. "And you say these specimens appeared unusual?" The supervisor's tone was carefully neutral. "Not just unusual, unnatural." The hunter found himself struggling to describe what he'd seen without sounding irrational. "Look, I've been guiding in these woods for 19 years. I know every species that calls this wilderness home. These specimens, they weren't right, and they were being preserved, studied. I understand your concern." The supervisor's voice took on a placating quality that immediately raised the hunter's hackles. "Here's what we'll do. I'll dispatch a ranger to meet you at the access point tomorrow morning. They can accompany you back to this location to investigate further." "Tomorrow? This can't wait until tomorrow. Whatever's happening here—" "Sir, I appreciate your diligence in reporting this," the supervisor interrupted, "but we have established protocols for investigating reports in the wilderness area. The earliest we can have someone meet you would be tomorrow at 800 hours. The hunter recognized bureaucratic stonewalling when he heard it. These specimens could be hazardous. There could be environmental contamination. People could be in danger. Rest assured, we take all such reports seriously. Aero 800 hours tomorrow at the eastern access point. The ranger will meet you there." After the call ended, the hunter stood motionless, satellite phone still clutched in his hand. The Forest Service's response had been professional on the surface, but he'd detected the undercurrent of dismissal in the supervisor's tone. They weren't treating this with the urgency it deserved. The sun had begun its early winter descent as he made his way back to the clearing. His dog, which had remained at a distance from the container throughout the investigation, now paced nervously at the clearing's edge. The animal's behavior only reinforced the hunter's unease. Back at the container, he made a decision. The authorities would arrive tomorrow, but something told him that might be too late. Whatever was happening in his woods, whatever had been buried here, it felt wrong on a fundamental level. The careful labeling, the research documents, the high-tech container, all suggested organization, funding, purpose. Using his satellite phone, he took additional photographs of the area surrounding the container, documenting the cigarette butts, boot prints, and campsite more thoroughly. Then, after careful consideration, he extracted one of the document folders from the container, handling it with a bandana to avoid leaving fingerprints. If the Forest Service didn't take this seriously, he would need evidence beyond just photographs. As darkness began to fall, the hunter made his way back toward his cabin, mind racing with questions. Who would bury research materials in the wilderness? Why these specific specimens? What was Phase 2? And why were there dates for the coming month? Most troublingly, if these were legitimate scientific samples, why hide them at all? The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned as he distanced himself from the clearing, but they brought no comfort. His woods, his wilderness, the place he had called home for nearly 2 decades, suddenly felt alien and threatening. The folder in his pack seemed to grow heavier with each mile. That night, after feeding his dog and checking in with his daughter, The hunter spread the contents of the folder on his cabin table. Most of the documents contained technical jargon beyond his understanding, but certain phrases jumped out. Genetic modification, environmental adaptation testing, controlled release trial, and most alarmingly, subject integration protocol. Sleep eluded him as he pored over the materials, making notes, trying to piece together a picture from the fragmentary information. By dawn, he had reached a conclusion. He couldn't wait for the Forest Service's representative. Whatever was happening in his woods required immediate investigation, and he couldn't shake the feeling that once official channels became involved, the truth would be buried deeper than that container had been. As the first light of morning painted the eastern sky, the hunter packed provisions for 3 days, additional ammunition, and the documents he'd recovered. The meeting with the Forest Service representative was scheduled for 800 hours, but he would not be there. Instead, he would follow those boot prints leading northwest from the clearing. Someone had buried that container. Someone had been monitoring those specimens, and someone knew what Phase 2 entailed. He left a note for his daughter, explaining only that he had extended a hunting trip unexpectedly and would return in a few days. The half-truth felt bitter on the paper, but he couldn't involve her in whatever this was. Not yet, not until he understood the danger more clearly. As he shouldered his pack and called his still nervous dog to his side, the hunter cast one last glance at the cabin. For the first time in years, he wondered if he would return. Then, checking his compass, he set off into the wilderness, following the trail of a mystery far more dangerous than any game he had ever hunted. Dawn broke with reluctant gray light over the small township that served as the administrative hub for the eastern wilderness region. The hunter had driven through the night, arriving as the first businesses were opening their doors. His truck, mud-spattered and worn, looked out of place among the newer vehicles in the municipal building's parking lot. The chocolate lab dozed in the passenger seat, finally relaxed now that they were miles from the clearing. The hunter sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. In 19 years of guiding, he'd rarely had cause to visit the county records office. His business was with the wilderness, not with bureaucracy. But the documents he'd recovered from the container had mentioned coordinates, dates stretching back decades, and references to facilities he'd never encountered in his extensive travels through the region. The county archives occupied the basement level of the municipal building, a utilitarian space with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a sickly pallor. At this early hour, only one employee was present, a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up from her computer terminal with the practiced disinterest of someone who had spent decades fielding inquiries from the public. "Archive access requires proper identification and a stated research purpose," she announced, before the hunter had even reached her desk. "Forms are to your right." The hunter nodded, taking one of the forms and filling it out with minimal information. For research purpose, he wrote, "Historical land use in eastern wilderness sector." Vague enough to avoid questions, specific enough to access what he needed. The archivist reviewed his form with pursed lips. "You're a hunting guide?" The question carried a hint of disapproval. "Most of your kind aren't interested in historical documentation." "I like to know the land I work on," the hunter replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Recently came across something unusual out there. Thought the archives might shed some light." Something in his demeanor must have convinced her. With a slight nod, she rose from her desk. "The Eastern Sector records are in Section C, shelves 15 through 22. Land surveys, property records, and historical permits are organized chronologically. Digital Terminal 3 has the index database for anything after 1995. Sign out any physical materials you remove from the shelves." The hunter spent the next 3 hours methodically working through the available records. The region's documented history was sparse before the 1940s, mostly trapping claims, early mining surveys, and rudimentary maps. But beginning in 1952, a series of land acquisitions caught his attention. A corporate entity listed as Northern Research Initiatives had purchased several thousand acres in the remote eastern wilderness, including the area surrounding the clearing where he'd found the container. The purchase records were followed by permit applications for what was described as environmental monitoring stations and wildlife research facilities. The permits had been approved with surprising speed, bypassing several standard review processes. The hunter noted the name of the regional administrator who had signed off on the expedited approvals, the father of the current Forest Service deputy supervisor who had taken his call. Most intriguing were the construction permits issued in 1954 for a research complex approximately 7 miles northwest of the clearing, the same direction the boot prints had led. The complex's blueprint showed a main facility with several outbuildings, all connected by underground passages. According to the records, the facility had been decommissioned in 1971, with all structures allegedly demolished and the land returned to natural condition. But the hunter found no demolition permits, no environmental impact studies for the removal of the facility, nothing to suggest the complex had actually been dismantled. Just a single letter from Northern Research Initiatives to the county administrator stating that operations had ceased and the site had been appropriately remediated. He requested access to subsequent land surveys of the area, but the archivist informed him that no official surveys had been conducted in that sector since 1973. Budget restrictions, she explained. Remote areas with no development potential aren't priorities. The digital records provided additional pieces to the puzzle. In 1997, a Forest Service ranger had filed an incident report describing unusual structures discovered during a routine patrol of the eastern sector. The report was flagged for follow-up investigation, but no subsequent documentation existed. The ranger's name appeared once more in personnel records, a transfer request to the Western Region filed 2 weeks after the incident report. The transfer had been approved within 24 hours. Most recently, a series of special access permits had been issued to a group identified only as Biome Research Consortium. These permits, authorized by the same Deputy Supervisor Wilkins who had taken his call, granted unrestricted access to the eastern wilderness sector, specifically the area surrounding the former research complex, for long-term environmental impact studies. The most recent permit had been issued just 3 months ago. The hunter printed relevant documents and saved digital copies to a USB drive he purchased from the municipal building's gift shop. As he was preparing to leave, the archivist approached his terminal. "Find what you were looking for?" Her tone was conversational, but her eyes held a wariness that hadn't been present earlier. "Just background for a client interested in the area's history," the hunter replied, gathering his materials. "Appreciate the access." The archivist hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You're not the first to look into that sector. Last summer, an environmental journalist spent days going through those same records. Made copies, asked questions." She glanced toward the stairwell, ensuring they were alone. 2 weeks later, someone from the regional administrator's office came in, reviewed our access logs, and questioned me about her research. The hunter kept his expression neutral. Interesting coincidence. The journalist had planned to return, had an appointment to review additional materials. The archivist adjusted her glasses. Never showed up. Never called to cancel. A chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature settled over the hunter. "You report that to anyone?" The archivist's lips thinned to a hard line. "To the same administrator's office that was asking about her?" "No." She returned to her desk without another word, her posture rigid with what might have been fear or defiance. By mid-morning, the hunter was on the road again, this time heading toward what the historical maps identified as the access point nearest to the decommissioned research facility. According to the blueprint, the complex had been built into the side of a ridge overlooking a small valley, terrain he knew well from tracking moose in previous seasons, though he'd never noticed any structures in the area. The access road ended 3 miles from the coordinates. From there, a faint trail led into the dense forest, barely visible beneath years of accumulated pine needles and undergrowth. The hunter parked his truck in a natural clearing, concealing it with branches cut from nearby spruce trees. The lab sensed his tension, staying close as they began the hike toward the facility's location. The trail showed signs of recent use: broken branches, compressed soil, the occasional boot print identical to those he'd observed leading away from the container. Someone had been making regular trips to the supposedly decommissioned facility. After an hour's hike, the hunter paused at the base of a steep incline. According to the coordinates, the research complex should be just beyond the ridge ahead. He secured his pack, checked his sidearm, a precaution he rarely took on standard hunts, and began the careful ascent, using the dense underbrush for cover. At the ridge's crest, he lay flat, using binoculars to survey the valley below. At first glance, the landscape appeared untouched, the same mix of spruce, hemlock, and birch that characterized the region, a small stream cutting through the valley floor. But as he adjusted the binoculars' focus, unnatural elements emerged from the wilderness camouflage. What appeared to be a sheer rock face on the valley's northern slope contained geometric anomalies. Closer inspection revealed a structure built into the hillside, its concrete facade weathered and discolored to mimic the surrounding stone. Camouflage netting covered portions of the entryway, and the surrounding vegetation had been carefully managed to maintain the illusion of wilderness while providing concealed access routes. This was no decommissioned facility. Someone had maintained it, disguised it, and continued to use it for decades after its official closure. The hunter spent the remainder of the day observing the facility from various vantage points around the ridge. No personnel were visible, no vehicles approached, but subtle signs of occupation were evident. A ventilation system disguised as a rock formation periodically expelled warm air, the stream had been partially diverted to provide water to the facility, and a sophisticated security camera disguised as a knothole in a dead tree continuously scanned the approach from the south. As dusk approached, the hunter retreated to a safe distance, established a makeshift camp well off any trail, and reviewed his findings. The facility's existence explained many elements: the container's sophisticated design, the research documents, perhaps even the unnatural specimens. But it raised more questions than it answered. What research required such secrecy? Why maintain the fiction of decommissioning? And most pressingly, what was Phase 2 that the documents indicated would begin in the coming month? That night, as his dog kept watch, the hunter updated his journal with detailed notes and rough sketches of the facility's visible exterior. Tomorrow, he would attempt a closer inspection of the research complex, a decision that carried considerable risk but seemed necessary given the authorities' apparent reluctance to investigate. As he closed his journal, a disturbing thought occurred to him. If the Forest Service deputy supervisor was connected to this facility through family ties, and if a journalist investigating the same records had mysteriously disappeared, then his satellite phone call reporting the container might have already alerted whoever operated the complex to his discovery. The meeting scheduled with the Forest Service ranger might not have been bureaucratic stonewalling, but something more sinister, an attempt to identify and neutralize a potential threat. The hunter checked his watch. By now, the ranger would have reported his failure to appear at the meeting point. His window of anonymous investigation was closing rapidly. The pre-dawn forest was shrouded in mist as the hunter broke camp and made his way back to the clearing where he'd discovered the container. He approached with extreme caution, using every technique developed over decades of stalking the wilderness's wariest inhabitants. The lab moved silently at his side, alert to any unusual scent or sound. From 50 yards out, he detected changes. The container was gone, not just reburied, completely removed. The excavation had been filled, the surface carefully restored to match the surrounding forest floor. Only the hunter's intimate knowledge of the clearing allowed him to identify where the container had been. Whoever had removed it had done so with professional efficiency, leaving minimal evidence of their presence. But the hunter's experienced eye caught what others might miss. Boot prints, the same distinctive tread pattern he'd noted previously, now formed a trail leading from the clearing directly toward the research facility. The removal team hadn't bothered concealing their tracks, suggesting either haste or confidence that no one would follow. Most concerning was a second set of prints, standard-issue Forest Service boots, size 10. The ranger who was supposed to meet him at the access point had instead come directly to the clearing. How had the ranger known the exact location? The hunter had provided coordinates during his call, but the precision with which the ranger had navigated to the clearing suggested prior knowledge. He photographed the evidence of the container's removal and the boot prints, then made a decision. Rather than follow the obvious trail to the research facility, he would return to the access road and approach from an unexpected direction. If he was being monitored, predictability would be fatal. By mid-morning, the hunter had circled around to approach the facility from the western ridge, a difficult route requiring a precarious descent down a near-vertical rock face. No maintained trails existed on this side, making surveillance unlikely. His years navigating the wilderness made the challenging terrain manageable, though his muscles protested the unusual demands. From his new vantage point, the western face of the facility became visible, less carefully camouflaged than the southern approach, suggesting the operators considered this route inaccessible. A service door was set into the concrete structure, partially obscured by natural rock formations. No obvious security cameras monitored this entrance. The hunter documented the door with his camera's telephoto lens, capturing images of what appeared to be a keypad access system and a weather-worn warning sign indicating restricted access. Moving carefully from cover to cover, he made his way down to the facility level, every sense heightened for signs of detection. The service door showed recent use. The surrounding vegetation had been repeatedly disturbed, and fresh scratches marked the metal around the keypad. Using his hunting knife, the hunter carefully removed the keypad's cover to expose the wiring beneath. Years of maintaining his own cabin's solar power system had given him basic knowledge of electrical systems. After studying the configuration, he bypassed the security circuit using wire from his emergency kit, causing the lock to disengage with a soft click. The hunter hesitated at the threshold. Entering the facility crossed a line from investigation to trespassing, potentially a serious offense. But the removed container, the unnatural specimens, the facility's deliberate concealment, and the apparent complicity of local authorities pushed him forward. Whatever was happening here went beyond ordinary research. The public deserved to know. Inside, emergency lighting cast a dim red glow over a utilitarian corridor that sloped gently downward. The air carried the same antiseptic odor he'd detected when opening the container, underlaid with the mustiness of an aging structure. The walls were raw concrete, showing cracks and water stains from decades of use. The facility had been maintained functionally, but not aesthetically. The hunter moved silently through the corridor, documenting everything with his camera. The lab remained close, hackles raised, responding to some stimulus beyond human perception. Several doors lined the corridor, most secured with the same keypad system he'd bypassed at the entrance. Without tools to open each one, the hunter continued deeper into the facility. The corridor terminated at a junction where 3 passages branched off in different directions. Faded symbols on the wall indicated different sections. A, leading left toward what was labeled research, B, straight ahead toward administration, and C, right toward containment. The hunter opted for route A, reasoning that research areas might contain documentation explaining the facility's purpose. The research section consisted of several laboratories in various states of use. Some appeared abandoned, equipment covered in dust and plastic sheeting. Others showed signs of recent activity, modern computers humming softly, specimen containers similar to those he'd found in the buried container, handwritten notes on clipboards. The hunter photographed everything methodically, paying special attention to documentation that might identify the facility's operators or purpose. In the third laboratory, he found what appeared to be a research journal left open on a workstation. The entries dated back several months, detailing experiments with terms like adaptive genetic modification, environmental stress response, and accelerated evolution. The technical language exceeded his understanding, but certain phrases triggered alarm. Unexpected mutation rate, containment protocols insufficient, and specimen viability exceeding projections. Most concerning was the final entry, dated just 2 days earlier. Phase d'assaut, preparations complete. Field testing scheduled to begin after final security sweep. Containment team reports unauthorized access in Sector 7. All non-essential materials relocated to secure storage. Monitoring increased. The hunter's blood ran cold. The container he'd discovered was non-essential material being relocated. His discovery had accelerated whatever Phase 2 entailed, and field testing suggested that whatever they were developing here was about to be released into the environment. His environment, the wilderness he'd guided clients through for nearly 2 decades. He photographed the journal entries, then continued through the research section. The final laboratory was larger than the others, dominated by what appeared to be incubation chambers connected to sophisticated monitoring equipment. Most chambers were empty, but 3 contained specimens similar to those he'd seen in the container, biological forms that resembled no natural species, suspended in clear liquid. Unlike the preserved specimens, these were clearly alive, exhibiting subtle movements and biological responses registered on the monitoring equipment. A nearby computer terminal displayed what appeared to be tracking data, topographical maps of the surrounding wilderness, with plotted coordinates forming patterns across the region. The most recent data showed concentration points in watersheds, wildlife corridors, and areas with high ungulate populations, precisely the areas the hunter used most frequently for guiding clients. Whatever was being developed in this facility wasn't contained within its walls. Test samples had already been distributed throughout the wilderness, strategically placed to interact with the existing ecosystem. The hunter downloaded the tracking data to his portable drive, knowing it would be crucial evidence. As he prepared to investigate the containment section, A distant sound froze him in place, a door opening, followed by voices echoing through the concrete corridors. Someone had entered the facility. The hunter quickly shut down the computer terminal, erasing evidence of his access, and sought an exit route. The service door he'd entered through was now blocked by whoever had arrived. He would need to find another way out. The hunter retreated deeper into the research section, seeking alternative exits. The lab sensed his urgency, moving silently alongside him. The voices grew louder as multiple people moved through the facility, their conversation echoing through the concrete corridors. Sweep the entire complex. Security breach confirmed at the West Service entrance. Priority is securing the Phase 2 specimens. Everything else is secondary. What about the container site? Any sign of the observer? Forest Service reported no show at the rendezvous. Tracking team deployed to the guide's registered address. The hunter's heart pounded against his ribs. They knew who he was. They had sent someone to his cabin, where his daughter might be alone. A maintenance closet provided temporary concealment as the search team moved through the research section. Through the partially opened door, the hunter glimpsed 3 individuals in tactical gear, armed with what appeared to be military-grade weapons. Not researchers, not Forest Service, something else entirely. When the search team moved to the adjacent laboratory, the hunter slipped out and made his way toward the administration section, hoping to find both information and an exit route. The lab followed, its training as a hunting companion making it virtually silent despite its size. The administration area contained offices in similar states of partial use. In what appeared to be the facility director's office, the hunter found a locked filing cabinet. Using techniques developed over years of maintaining hunting equipment, he managed to compromise the lock without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. Inside were personnel files for the facility's staff, researchers, security, maintenance, names, backgrounds, security clearances. The hunter photographed several pages, noting that many staff members held positions in regional government offices, including the Forest Service. The corruption extended beyond a single deputy supervisor. A separate folder contained documentation of previous security breaches, 3 incidents over the past 5 years where outside observers had discovered evidence of the facility's operations. Each case included photographs of the individuals, surveillance reports, and a final disposition form with the same chilling designation. Situation resolved, subject neutralized, environmental cover story implemented. Among these was a file for the environmental journalist the archivist had mentioned, complete with photographs of her reviewing the same county records he had examined, followed by surveillance of her hiking in the eastern sector. The final report noted that her vehicle had been found abandoned at a trailhead, triggering a standard search and rescue operation that had been called off after 3 days. The case was officially classified as a missing hiker, presumed victim of wildlife attack or exposure. As the hunter documented these files, a slip of paper slid from beneath the cabinet, a handwritten note that read, "Hunter Guide reported container discovery. Neutralization authorized. Residents under surveillance. Will intercept at rendezvous point if subject appears." The note was dated that morning. The search team's voices grew closer. The hunter had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they reached the administration section. He needed an exit and found one in a facility map mounted on the office wall. A ventilation shaft in the adjacent records room led to an emergency exit on the north face of the ridge. The hunter had just reached the records room when the facility's emergency lights switched from red to flashing yellow. A mechanized voice announced, "Security breach in Administration Section B. All personnel implement lockdown protocols. Containment team to Section B." The ventilation access panel required a security code, but the hunter had no time for finesse. Using his hunting knife and brute force, he compromised the panel and pulled it free. The shaft beyond was narrow but navigable. He lifted the lab into the opening first, then pulled himself up, replacing the damaged panel behind him to delay pursuit. The shaft extended 50 yards before terminating at a grated opening overlooking the northern slope. The grate was secured with rusted bolts that yielded to the hunter's multi-tool. Fresh air flooded the shaft as he removed the grate and scanned the terrain beyond. A steep rocky slope led down to dense forest, difficult to navigate but offering concealment from pursuers. The hunter and his dog emerged onto the hillside just as alarm sirens began to wail within the facility. No time for caution. He half climbed, half slid down the slope, using trees and outcroppings to control his descent. The lab followed, its agility on rough terrain proving invaluable. Within minutes, they reached the forest below and continued moving north, away from both the facility and the main access trails. After an hour of rapid movement, the hunter paused to assess his situation. The immediate danger of capture had passed, but his discovery had escalated the threat significantly. They knew his identity. They had surveillance on his home. They had authorized neutralization. And based on the files he'd seen, this organization had successfully eliminated previous threats without consequence. More pressingly, they were proceeding with Phase 2, whatever environmental contamination or biological release that entailed. The tracking data he'd downloaded showed the testing already underway, focused on areas frequented by wildlife and hikers. Whatever they had engineered in that facility was already being introduced to the ecosystem. The hunter needed to warn someone with the authority to intervene, someone beyond the reach of the regional corruption he'd documented. But first, he needed to ensure his daughter's safety. If surveillance teams were watching his cabin, she could be in immediate danger. Using his satellite phone, he sent a coded text message they had established for emergencies, a request for her to implement their predefined evacuation protocol. The response came within minutes. Understood, already at ants. Strange men watching cabin since morning. Forest Service vehicle. Relief flooded through him. She was safe, her instincts having already alerted her to the danger. The ant reference was part of their code. She had gone to their emergency rendezvous point, a cabin owned by a trusted friend 50 miles west of their home. With his daughter secure, the hunter turned to the evidence he'd gathered. The satellite phone's camera had documented the container, the facility, the research journals, the personnel files, and the tracking data. But the phone itself was potentially compromised. If they knew his identity, they might be monitoring his communications. He needed secure transmission methods and authorities beyond regional influence. The State Environmental Protection Agency might have jurisdiction over biological contamination, but establishing credibility would be challenging without supporting context. The regional FBI field office dealt with federal land crimes, but penetrating bureaucracy would take time he might not have. The hunter's thoughts turned to a contact from years earlier, a national investigative journalist who had spent a season with him researching an expose on wildlife trafficking. The reporter worked for a major news outlet with resources to verify evidence and legal teams to protect sources. Most importantly, publication would create public awareness that might make it harder for the organization to continue operating in secret. Using the satellite phone's browser, the hunter accessed an encrypted email service through which he had occasionally communicated with previous clients. He created a new account, then composed a message to the journalist containing a summary of his discoveries and several key photographs. He indicated that complete documentation was available but required secure transmission methods. As a proof of authenticity, he included coordinates of the facility and the container site. Before sending, he added a final note. Previous investigators have been neutralized. Regional authorities compromised. Biological agents already deployed in wilderness. Phase 2 imminent. Require immediate national attention and containment response. The hunter had just sent the email when a notification appeared on his satellite phone. An emergency alert from the Forest Service announcing temporary closure of the eastern wilderness sector due to potentially hazardous wildlife activity. The cover story was already being implemented. As darkness fell, the hunter made camp in a dense thicket miles from any trail. He needed to maintain movement, avoid predictable locations, and find a secure means of transmitting his complete evidence. The lab kept watch while he reviewed his options, planning routes that would keep him clear of areas likely to be monitored. In the distance, he heard the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, unusual for this remote region, especially after dark. Search patterns. They were hunting him now, using resources that suggested government support. Whatever he had stumbled upon reached higher than he had initially suspected. The hunter checked his weapon, inventoried his supplies, and studied his topographical maps. If the journalist responded, he would have potential allies. If not, he would need to find alternative channels to expose what was happening. The specimens, the facility, the tracking data, the personnel files, all pointed to deliberate biological experimentation in protected wilderness, with unknown consequences for the ecosystem and potentially the wider environment. As the helicopter sounds faded into the distance, the hunter made his decision. He would continue north toward the state border, avoiding population centers where surveillance would be easier. From there, he could potentially reach federal authorities directly, bypassing regional corruption. Before settling in for a few hours of necessary rest, he encrypted his photo documentation and uploaded it to a cloud storage service accessible through an anonymous account. Insurance in case he was captured or neutralized before reaching safety. The first phase of his investigation was complete. He had confirmed the existence of the facility, documented its operations, and identified key personnel. But the real challenge lay ahead, exposing the truth while evading an organization with the resources and apparent authorization to eliminate threats without consequence. As he dozed fitfully, one hand on his rifle, and the lab alert beside him, the hunter reflected on how quickly his life had transformed. 3 days ago, he had been a guide preparing for a corporate client's arrival. Now he was a fugitive with evidence of what might be the most significant environmental crime in the region's history. Whatever Phase 2 entailed, he was determined to stop it, for the wilderness he called home, for the clients who trusted his knowledge of these woods, and for a daughter who deserved a future in an untainted world. The northern sky was tinged with the faint green glow of aurora, as the hunter crouched beside a small stream, refilling his canteen. 3 days of continuous movement through the wilderness had left him exhausted but alive. The helicopter patrols had intensified, focusing on access points and trails, but his intimate knowledge of the terrain had allowed him to evade detection. The lab lay nearby, alert despite obvious fatigue. The dog had proven invaluable, sensing approaching search teams before they came within visual range. Years of hunting together had forged a partnership that transcended training, an intuitive connection that had saved them both repeatedly over the past 72 hours. The investigative journalist had responded to his message, arranging a meeting at a truck stop near the state border. Neutral ground, public enough for safety but remote enough to avoid unwanted attention. But reaching the rendezvous point would require crossing 15 miles of exposed terrain, including a highway patrolled by vehicles that almost certainly included Forest Service and local law enforcement. The hunter inventoried his remaining supplies. The satellite phone's battery showed 42% remaining, enough for emergency communications but requiring conservation. His rifle was clean and functional, though ammunition was limited to 17 rounds. The external battery pack for his camera and portable drive remained at 76% charge. Food rations would last another day if carefully managed. Most valuable was the evidence accumulated on his portable drive: photographs of the container and specimens, facility blueprints, research journals, personnel files, and the tracking data showing the distribution of test specimens throughout the wilderness. If anything happened to him, this information needed to reach the proper authorities. Using the satellite phone's camera, the hunter recorded a video statement. He spoke clearly but quietly, documenting his discoveries chronologically, identifying key personnel within the Forest Service and regional administration, and explaining the apparent purpose of the research facility. He detailed the evidence of previous neutralizations and the imminent implementation of Phase 2. "My name is..." He paused, considering operational security. "I am a licensed hunting guide with 19 years of experience in the eastern wilderness sector. Everything I've documented has been photographed or recorded and will be transmitted to multiple recipients if I fail to reach my destination. I believe this organization is conducting unauthorized biological experimentation in protected wilderness areas, potentially introducing genetically modified organisms into watersheds that supply drinking water to communities throughout the region." He concluded with the coordinates of the facility, the container discovery site, and the locations marked in the tracking data as specimen release points. After reviewing the recording, he encrypted the file and scheduled it for automatic transmission to the journalist and 3 national environmental protection agencies if he didn't enter a cancellation code within 24 hours. From his emergency kit, the hunter extracted a small, waterproof container. Inside was a handwritten letter to his daughter, prepared years earlier for worst-case scenarios. He added a brief addendum explaining his current situation and the importance of the evidence he'd gathered. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back. Everything I've done was to protect you and the wilderness we both love. The evidence I've gathered must reach the national authorities. Trust no one from regional offices. The journalist will help. Her contact information is with our emergency documents. I love you more than these woods," which is saying something. The hunter sealed the letter in a small waterproof pouch and buried it beneath a distinctive rock formation, marking the GPS coordinates in a text message draft addressed to his daughter's emergency phone. He didn't send it. Transmission might be tracked, but saved it for manual delivery if necessary. Before dawn, he contacted the trusted friend sheltering his daughter using their predetermined code phrases. Through carefully worded exchanges that would appear innocuous to monitoring systems, he confirmed she remained safe and informed the friend of the scheduled meeting with the journalist. "If I don't make contact by tomorrow evening, the package needs alternate delivery," he explained, using their established protocol for emergency situations. "The location is marked. Full exposure required." "Understood," came the reply. "The young one is secure. We'll ensure delivery if needed." The friend, a former military contractor who had retired to Alaska seeking solitude, was one of the few people the hunter trusted implicitly. They had saved each other's lives during a blizzard 7 years earlier, establishing a bond that transcended casual friendship. If anyone could ensure the evidence reached proper authorities, it was this individual. As first light painted the eastern horizon, the hunter prepared for the final leg of his journey. He buried unnecessary equipment to lighten his load, retaining only essentials: the satellite phone, portable drive, camera, minimal survival gear, his sidearm with 2 magazines, and his hunting knife. The lab watched attentively, sensing the gravity of their situation through the hunter's focused efficiency. The hunter knelt beside the dog, checking its paws for injury and offering one of the remaining protein bars, which the lab accepted with uncharacteristic delicacy. "Almost done, boy," he murmured, the first words he'd spoken aloud in days. "Just need to get across the valley." With a final glance at the rising sun, the hunter shouldered his reduced pack, checked his compass, and began moving north toward the state border. His expression reflected not fear but resolute determination, the same focus that had allowed him to track elusive prey through impossible terrain for nearly 2 decades. Whatever awaited at the research facility, whatever phase 2 entailed, it would not proceed unchallenged. Not while he still drew breath, not in his wilderness. The research facility's northern annex rose from the forest floor like a concrete tumor, its camouflage netting and painted exterior failing to disguise its industrial nature in the harsh midday light. From his position on the eastern ridge, the hunter observed the increased activity through his binoculars. Personnel in hazmat suits loading sealed containers onto all-terrain vehicles, security teams establishing perimeter checkpoints, researchers consulting tablets while gesturing toward the wilderness beyond. Phase 2 was no longer imminent. It was underway. The hunter had altered his escape plan upon witnessing this activity. Before crossing the border, before meeting the journalist, he needed to document exactly what was being deployed into his wilderness. The tracking data had shown distribution points, but not the nature of what was being distributed. Without that information, authorities might not grasp the urgency of the situation. Security at the main facility entrance had been reinforced, but the emergency ventilation shaft he'd used for escape remained unguarded, an oversight suggesting they didn't know exactly how he had entered and exited the complex. Using the ridgeline for cover, the hunter circled back to approach the shaft from above, a difficult climbing route that security protocols apparently deemed impossible to navigate. The lab remained hidden in a secure location half a mile away. This infiltration was too dangerous to risk his loyal companion. If the hunter didn't return within 3 hours, the dog was trained to make its way to a predetermined rendezvous point near the highway, where passing motorists would likely offer assistance. Accessing the ventilation shaft from above required technical climbing skills beyond casual hiking. Fortunately, the hunter's background included 2 years with mountain rescue before he'd become a guide. Using tree roots and natural rock formations as anchors, he descended the sheer face to reach the external grate. As suspected, no additional security measures had been implemented at this access point. The facility interior was significantly more active than during his previous infiltration. Voices echoed through the concrete corridors, and the emergency lighting had been replaced with full illumination. The hunter moved with extreme caution, using maintenance closets and unused offices to avoid detection as he made his way deeper into the complex. His target was the central laboratory he hadn't accessed previously, the area marked containment on the facility map. Based on the movement patterns of personnel, this section appeared to be the staging area for whatever was being distributed throughout the wilderness. The hunter positioned himself in an electrical control room overlooking the main containment laboratory. Through a reinforced observation window, he could document activities without entering the high-security area itself. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. The containment lab housed dozens of specimens similar to those he'd discovered in the buried container, but these weren't preserved in jars. They were alive, developing in transparent incubation chambers. Each specimen resembled a hybrid of recognizable Alaskan wildlife with disturbing modifications. Moose calves with elongated limbs and unnatural musculature, wolf pups with skull structures that accommodated brain capacity far beyond natural development, fish with respiratory systems apparently designed for both water and air. Most alarming were the modifications visible only under the laboratory's specialized imaging equipment displayed on wall monitors. Internal organs structured for extreme efficiency, immune systems designed to resist virtually all known pathogens, reproductive systems modified for accelerated maturation and fertility. Researchers in biological containment suits transferred mature specimens from incubation chambers to distribution containers, specialized transport units with environmental controls and GPS tracking. Each container was logged in a central database projected on the laboratory's main screen, showing intended release coordinates and monitoring protocols. The hunter documented everything with his camera, using the telephoto lens to capture details of the specimens, the database information, and the faces of key personnel supervising the operation. One face struck him with particular force. Deputy Supervisor Wilkins himself, not wearing a containment suit but observing from a supervisory position, consulting with what appeared to be the lead scientist. As the hunter photographed this interaction, a researcher approached Wilkins with a tablet displaying what looked like a topographical map. Even from a distance, the hunter recognized the area. It was the watershed that supplied drinking water to 3 counties, including the township where his daughter's school was located. Wilkins nodded approval, and the researcher directed technicians to prepare a special container, larger than the others, housing a specimen the hunter couldn't clearly see from his position. The urgency surrounding this particular deployment suggested significance beyond the routine releases being processed elsewhere in the laboratory. The hunter needed to document whatever was in that container. He repositioned to capture a better angle just as the specimen was transferred to its transport unit. For a brief moment, the creature was visible, amphibious in nature, roughly the size of a beaver, but with distinctly unnatural features. Its skin glistened with a secretion that the technicians carefully avoided touching, even through their protective gear. A researcher activated a monitoring tablet connected to the container, and data flashed across the screen. Chemical compounds with formulas the hunter didn't recognize, projected concentration rates in water systems, and most alarmingly, a neurological impact assessment with population figures for downstream communities. This wasn't merely ecosystem manipulation. It was deliberate contamination of human water supplies. The hunter had seen enough. This evidence would convince even the most skeptical authorities of the need for immediate intervention. He documented the final preparations as the specialized container was loaded onto a dedicated all-terrain vehicle, then began his careful retreat toward the ventilation shaft. He had nearly reached the maintenance corridor when a security alert blared through the facility. For one terrifying moment, he feared he'd been discovered. But the announcement targeted a different concern. Security breach at North Perimeter Checkpoint Alpha. All non-essential personnel initiate lockdown procedures. Tactical team to North Perimeter. The hunter used the distraction to make his way to the ventilation shaft. Whatever had happened at the perimeter, it had drawn security away from the facility interior. He reached the shaft without encountering personnel, pulled himself into the narrow passage, and began the arduous crawl toward the external grate. Halfway through the shaft, voices became audible from a connecting ventilation passage, security personnel using the maintenance systems to bypass lockdown protocols. Perimeter breach was a false alarm. Return to standard patrol routes. What about the guide? Any updates on his location? Surveillance team lost him near the eastern ridge. They're expanding the search perimeter. Director wants him found before the watershed deployment is complete. The hunter froze, controlling his breathing to remain silent as the security team passed through the intersection just yards from his position. When their voices faded, he continued toward the external grate, moving with agonizing slowness to minimize noise. At the exit point, he paused to scan the terrain through the grate's narrow openings. The area appeared clear, but instinct warned him to exercise extreme caution. Using his hunting knife to loosen the grate's mounting screws, he created just enough space to squeeze through the opening. The hunter had barely emerged onto the rocky slope when a shout from below confirmed his worst fears. Movement on the north face. Target confirmed. The crack of a rifle shot preceded the impact of a bullet on the rock face inches from his position. The hunter rolled behind a natural outcropping as two more shots fractured stone where he had been moments earlier. 3 security personnel were ascending the slope, while others established firing positions from below. With the facility at his back and armed pursuers approaching from multiple angles, the hunter's options were severely limited. The steep cliff face to his right offered the only possibility of escape. A near-vertical descent no rational person would attempt without proper climbing equipment. The hunter was not fully rational in that moment. Survival instinct overrode conventional judgment. Using the rocky outcroppings for minimal handholds, he began a controlled fall down the cliff face, part climbing, part sliding, staying close to the stone to minimize exposure to gunfire. Bullets continued to impact around him, but the awkward shooting angles and his rapid descent made him a difficult target. 50 feet down, he lost his footing completely, tumbling the final distance to land hard on a narrow ledge. Pain lanced through his left ankle, but adrenaline allowed him to push through, continuing his desperate escape along the ledge and into the denser forest beyond. The security team's shouts grew more distant as the hunter used every evasion technique developed over decades in the wilderness. He crossed streams to mask his scent and trail, used fallen logs to avoid leaving footprints, and changed direction repeatedly to confuse pursuit. His injured ankle protested with each step, but the alternative to movement was capture, or worse. By late afternoon, the hunter had reached the rendezvous point where he'd left the lab. The dog greeted him with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, sensing his injury and distress. Together they continued north, the hunter now moving with a pronounced limp but maintaining a pace born of desperation. The sun was setting when they reached the highway, a 2-lane road that connected the region to the state beyond. The hunter concealed himself in the tree line, observing traffic patterns. As expected, Forest Service vehicles patrolled regularly, joined by local law enforcement and unmarked SUVs that matched those he'd seen at the research facility. The truck stop where he was to meet the journalist lay 5 miles east, walkable under normal circumstances but challenging with his injured ankle. More concerning was the checkpoint established 2 miles ahead, where officers were stopping and inspecting all vehicles. The hunter observed the checkpoint procedures from concealment. Commercial trucks received cursory inspection, while passenger vehicles underwent more thorough searches. Driver identification was being checked against a database, almost certainly including his description. After 30 minutes of observation, the hunter identified a potential passage, a logging truck that had pulled off the highway into a small rest area half a mile from his position. The driver had exited the cab and appeared to be conducting a vehicle inspection before continuing toward the checkpoint. Moving quickly despite his injury, the hunter circled through the forest to approach the truck from the blind side. The lab followed silently, trained to maintain stealth during hunting expeditions. When the driver moved to the front of the vehicle to check something under the hood, the hunter and dog slipped beneath the tarp covering the trailer, concealing themselves among the freshly cut timber. The journey through the checkpoint was tense but uneventful. The truck slowed, voices were exchanged, and after a brief inspection of the cab and a cursory glance at the load, they were waved through. 20 minutes later, the truck pulled into the truck stop complex for refueling. The hunter and the lab remained motionless until the driver entered the restaurant, then carefully extracted themselves from the timber load. Pain shot through the hunter's ankle as he dropped to the ground, but the security of the busy truck stop provided immediate relief. Dozens of vehicles, travelers, and commercial drivers moved through the area. Perfect camouflage for a meeting that could change the course of what was happening in his wilderness. The truck stop diner buzzed with the ambient noise of travelers, silverware clinking against plates, coffee cups being refilled, fragments of conversation about road conditions and delivery schedules. The hunter sat at a corner booth, baseball cap pulled low, the lab resting at his feet. His injured ankle was propped on the bench opposite, throbbing with each heartbeat but manageable. He had selected this position carefully, back to the wall, clear view of both entrances, proximity to the rear exit, and partially obscured from casual observation by a large potted plant. The portable drive containing his evidence lay on the table beside a cup of untouched coffee, ready for immediate transfer. At precisely 7:15 p.m., a woman in her mid-30s entered the diner, pausing at the threshold to scan the room with practiced efficiency. The hunter recognized her from the single press photograph he'd found online, the investigative journalist whose expose on wildlife trafficking had won a national award 3 years earlier. She wore hiking clothes that wouldn't attract attention in this region, and carried a leather messenger bag over one shoulder. Their eyes met briefly, and she approached his table without hesitation or obvious recognition. "Mind if I join you? Place is pretty full." The casual inquiry carried no hint of their prearranged meeting. The hunter nodded toward the bench opposite. "Help yourself." The journalist slid into the booth, ordered coffee from a passing waitress, then directed her attention to the hunter. "Nasty weather moving in from the north. You heading south to avoid it?" The code phrase confirmed her identity. The hunter responded with the agreed counterphrase, "Already weathered worse storms this season." Only then did her professional demeanor soften slightly. "You look like you've been through hell." "Close enough." The hunter pushed the portable drive across the table. "Everything's here. The facility, the specimens, the personnel files, the deployment data. They're releasing genetically modified organisms into the watershed as we speak." The journalist didn't touch the drive immediately. "You mentioned previous investigators being neutralized. How certain are you about that claim?" "I found their files. 3 cases in 5 years, including an environmental journalist who disappeared last summer. All listed as subject neutralized with environmental cover stories implemented." She nodded, finally taking the drive and securing it in an internal pocket of her messenger bag. "I've arranged secure transmission to my editorial team and legal department. They're standing by to verify and prepare for publication." "Publication won't be enough," the hunter said, leaning forward. "They're contaminating water supplies now. Today, whatever these organisms are designed to do, it affects human neural function. I saw the assessments." The journalist's expression hardened. "I've made additional arrangements. A contact at the Environmental Protection Agency is waiting for confirmation before deploying emergency response teams. I've also briefed colleagues at 3 national news networks who will break the story simultaneously once we verify key elements. The local authorities are compromised. Forest Service, county administration, local law enforcement. They're all involved. That's why we're bypassing them entirely." She extracted a satellite phone different from the hunter's model. "I'm sending sample images to my team now. Once verified, the full protocol activates." The hunter watched as she connected the portable drive to her device, selected key photographs, and transmitted them through what appeared to be a secure connection. Within minutes, her phone signaled an incoming message. "Verification confirmed. They're moving." She looked up at the hunter. "Your evidence is now being transmitted to the EPA, FBI Environmental Crimes Unit, and Centers for Disease Control. Emergency protocols are being implemented for potential watershed contamination." Relief washed over the hunter, tempered by the knowledge that the deployment was already underway. "How quickly can they respond?" "Containment teams were pre-positioned based on your initial contact. They'll reach the facility within the hour. Watershed monitoring stations are being activated throughout the region, and public water supplies will be shut down as a precautionary measure." As they spoke, the diner's television switched to a breaking news alert. The volume was too low to hear, but the banner across the bottom read, "Environmental emergency declared in Alaska's eastern wilderness region. Potential water contamination." The journalist nodded toward the screen. "And so it begins." Within the hour, the truck stop transformed into an impromptu operations center as federal vehicles arrived in waves. Environmental Protection Agency response teams established monitoring stations in the parking lot. Centers for Disease Control personnel set up decontamination equipment. FBI agents secured the perimeter and began questioning travelers who had recently come from the eastern wilderness region. From a secluded observation point on the 2nd floor of the attached motel, the hunter watched the operation unfold. His ankle had been professionally bandaged by a CDC medic who asked no questions beyond those relevant to potential exposure. The lab dozed nearby, finally relaxed after days of constant vigilance. The journalist joined him at the window, offering a tablet displaying live news coverage. Every major network was broadcasting the story, their headlines competing for dramatic impact. Government whistleblower exposes illegal biological testing in Alaska wilderness. Corporate-funded research facility releasing modified organisms into public water supply. Decades-long conspiracy uncovered as federal agents raid secret laboratory. Aerial footage showed black helicopters descending on the research facility, while hazmat-suited teams established containment zones around the watershed. Areas identified in the tracking data. A scrolling ticker reported that Deputy Supervisor Wilkins and 17 others had been taken into federal custody, while water supplies to 3 counties had been temporarily suspended pending comprehensive testing. "They're calling you a whistleblower," the journalist observed. "The FBI wants to conduct a formal interview once the immediate crisis is contained." The hunter shook his head. "I'm just a guide who found something that didn't belong in my woods. A guide who documented everything methodically, evaded professional security teams, and delivered irrefutable evidence of one of the most significant environmental crimes in recent history." She studied him with professional assessment. "My editors want an exclusive interview when you're ready. My daughter's safety comes first. Once I know she's secure, once I understand exactly what they were doing and why." He let the thought trail off, watching another convoy of federal vehicles pass below. "Fair enough." The journalist handed him a secure satellite phone. "When you're ready. This can't be traced." As night fell, the hunter stood alone at the window, watching the distant glow of floodlights illuminating the forest to the south, the emergency response teams establishing a perimeter around the facility and its outbuildings. The immediate danger had passed. Whatever Phase 2 had been designed to accomplish, it had been interrupted before completion. His wilderness would recover. The organisms already released would be tracked, contained, studied. The research that created them would be exposed, its purpose revealed through thorough investigation. Those responsible would face justice through proper channels. For the hunter, the most important outcome wasn't the headlines or the federal response or even the eventual prosecutions. It was what wouldn't happen now. Hikers wouldn't disappear without explanation. Wildlife wouldn't develop unnatural characteristics. Watersheds wouldn't carry engineered contaminants to unsuspecting communities. His ankle throbbed as he shifted his weight, a reminder of the cost extracted by his 3-day ordeal. But as he watched the precisely coordinated federal response below, a profound sense of justification settled over him. 19 years guiding in those woods had given him an obligation to protect them, not just from overhunting or environmental degradation, but from whatever perversion of nature had been cultivated in that hidden facility. The lab stirred from its rest, coming to stand beside him at the window. The hunter placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the familiar connection that had guided them through countless hunts and now through a very different kind of pursuit. "We did what needed doing," he said quietly, watching another helicopter sweep toward the facility with its searchlight cutting through the Alaskan night. "That's all any of us can do." Tomorrow would bring debriefings, formal statements, medical examinations, and reunion with his daughter. The full story would emerge through investigation and reporting. Public outrage would demand accountability. Systems would be implemented to prevent similar occurrences. But tonight, the hunter allowed himself the simple satisfaction of having protected his wilderness, of having encountered something unnatural and horrific, and having taken the necessary actions to ensure it would not remain hidden. He had done what any guardian of the land would do, what any father would do, what any witness to corruption must do. He had brought light to darkness, exposed what was meant to stay buried. And in doing so, he had honored the 19 years he'd spent learning every trail, every ridge, every clearing of the wilderness he called home. Winter descended upon the Alaskan wilderness with brutal efficiency, burying the evidence of autumn's chaos beneath feet of pristine snow. 3 months had passed since the hunter had delivered his documentation to the national authorities. 3 months of depositions, testimonies, medical evaluations, and careful rehabilitation of his injured ankle. From the window of his cabin, he watched the morning sun illuminate the snow-laden spruce trees surrounding his property. The lab dozed before the wood stove, occasionally twitching in dreams that the hunter hoped were more peaceful than his own. On the table lay the morning's newspaper, one of dozens that had covered the unfolding investigation with headlines that seemed drawn from science fiction rather than reality. Senate Subcommittee reveals decades of unauthorized biological experimentation in protected wilderness. The official inquiry had moved with unprecedented speed and transparency, driven by the irrefutable evidence the hunter had provided and the immediate public health concerns of potential watershed contamination. The FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit had led the initial raid, accompanied by specialists from the Centers for Disease Control, Environmental Protection Agency, and military biological containment teams. What they discovered within the facility exceeded even the hunter's documentation. The visible research areas represented merely the current phase of operations. Beneath the main complex, accessible only through heavily secured elevators, lay 3 additional subterranean levels housing what investigators described as extensive transgenic development chambers and evolutionary acceleration environments. The corporate entity behind the operations, Northern Research Initiatives, proved to be a shell company within a complex network of subsidiaries, ultimately controlled by a multinational pharmaceutical conglomerate. Financial records revealed decades of black budget funding channeled through classified defense contracts, agricultural research grants, and private venture capital specialized in disruptive biotechnology. Most disturbing were the personnel files recovered from secure servers. 47 individuals had been classified as field observation subjects over the past 2 decades, people who had accidentally discovered evidence of the facility's operations or the biological specimens released into the environment. Of these, 39 were listed as neutralized, with detailed documentation of staged accidents, falsified search and rescue operations, and manufactured environmental exposure incidents. The environmental journalist mentioned by the county archivist was among them. Her vehicle hadn't been found abandoned. It had been deliberately placed at the trailhead after she was captured investigating the facility. Her disappearance had been meticulously orchestrated, with evidence planted to support the official narrative of a hiking accident. The hunter had read her file with particular attention. She had been investigating the same watershed contamination he had documented, following similar historical records to the same conclusions. The facility's security team had intercepted her 2 miles from the complex. Her current status was listed as subject retained for longitudinal neurological response study, a clinical euphemism whose implications made the hunter's blood run cold. Federal agents had located specialized containment chambers in the facility's lowest level, where 7 observation subjects were being held. Individuals who had discovered elements of the operation and been captured for use in experimental protocols. The environmental journalist was among them, along with a Forest Service ranger who had filed a similar discovery report years earlier and supposedly transferred to another region. Their conditions were described only as stabilized in official statements, with privacy concerns cited for the lack of detail. The legal consequences had been swift and far-reaching. 29 corporate executives faced federal charges including conspiracy, environmental crimes, kidnapping, and in some cases homicide. 17 government officials at regional, state, and federal levels had been indicted for corruption, conspiracy, and abuse of authority, including Deputy Supervisor Wilkins and his superiors in the regional administration. The hunter's satellite phone rang, interrupting his review of the newspaper. The secure line connected directly to the FBI special agent who had served as his primary contact throughout the investigation. "We've received the final environmental assessment from the EPA," the agent reported without preamble. "Thought you should know." "How bad?" The hunter's voice remained steady, though his grip on the phone tightened. "Better than initially feared. The organisms released into the main watershed were captured at the monitoring stations installed after your warning. The modified genetics were unstable in natural conditions. They couldn't survive outside controlled environments." "And the secondary watersheds?" A pause. 97% containment confirmed. The remaining areas show trace genetic markers but no viable specimens. The ecosystem appears to be neutralizing the introduced elements naturally. The hunter closed his eyes briefly. "And the affected communities?" "No detected neurological anomalies in any tested population. Whatever they intended, it hadn't progressed to delivery stage." Another pause. "You stopped this before it could cause widespread harm. The Congressional Committee wanted me to convey their formal acknowledgement of that fact." After the call ended, the hunter remained at the window, watching a raven land on a snow-covered branch. The bird's natural movements, its perfect adaptation to the harsh winter environment, carried a beauty he appreciated more deeply now. His wilderness had been violated but not conquered. Nature's resilience had prevailed where human institutions had failed. The television in the corner, rarely used before these events, now regularly broadcast updates on what the media had dubbed the wilderness conspiracy. The morning news showed footage of corporate executives being escorted into federal court, followed by statements from environmental advocacy groups demanding expanded protections for wilderness areas and increased transparency in research permit processes. Most significant was the announcement of a comprehensive federal review of all biological research permits issued for protected lands nationwide, accompanied by the establishment of an independent oversight commission comprising environmental scientists, indigenous representatives, and public health experts. The president had signed an executive order mandating this review as a direct response to the Alaskan discovery. The hunter's satellite phone rang again, this time his daughter calling from the University Environmental Science program where she had enrolled for early admission after their ordeal. She had become something of a celebrity among her peers, the daughter of the wilderness whistleblower, though she handled the attention with characteristic grace and focus. "The governor's office called again," she reported. "They're insisting you attend the ceremony next week." "I've given my testimony," the hunter replied, watching the raven take flight from the snow-laden branch. "The facts speak for themselves." "Dad," her tone carried the loving exasperation he had come to recognize over the years. "This isn't about testimony. It's about recognition, about showing the public that one person standing up for the truth matters." The hunter's resistance softened at his daughter's words. Not for the accolades or recognition, but for the principle she articulated, the idea that bearing witness to corruption carried an obligation that extended beyond personal comfort. "I'll consider it," he conceded, knowing his daughter would recognize this as the closest he came to agreement on such matters. "I've already told them you'll be there," she replied with the pragmatic efficiency that made her such an effective business partner. "The lab and I will pick you up Tuesday morning. Wear your formal guide uniform, the one without the coffee stains." The hunter smiled despite himself. Even after all they had endured, his daughter's resilient spirit remained intact, stronger perhaps, forged by adversity into something unbreakable. The state capitol building rose from the snow-covered landscape like an architectural anomaly, too formal, too structured for the rugged Alaskan environment. The hunter felt equally out of place in his seldom-worn formal guide uniform, standing uncomfortably among government officials, law enforcement representatives, and media personnel gathered for the ceremony. His daughter stood beside him, radiating pride that made his discomfort bearable. She had insisted on accompanying him, handling the logistics and deflecting the more intrusive media inquiries with professional skill that belied her 17 years. The lab had remained at their hotel, deemed inappropriate for the formal proceedings, despite the hunter's argument that the dog deserved recognition equal to his own. The governor's address was mercifully concise, focusing on the broader implications rather than personal glorification, a choice the hunter deeply appreciated. "Today we acknowledge not just an individual act of courage, but a fundamental truth about our relationship with the wilderness that defines our state," the governor stated. "When we fail in our stewardship, when corporate interests supersede environmental protection, when oversight becomes complicity, it often falls to a single voice to restore the balance." The hunter accepted the governor's Environmental Stewardship Medal with a stiff nod, declining the invitation to speak. The daughter stepped forward instead, addressing the assembled officials and media with composed eloquence. "My father has always taught me that the wilderness doesn't belong to us. We belong to it," she began. His actions weren't heroic in his mind, just necessary. The real recognition today should go to those who didn't survive to see justice: the environmental journalist whose investigation preceded ours, the ranger who filed reports that went unheeded, the hikers and researchers classified as subjects in clinical files. Her words shifted the ceremony's focus from celebration to solemn acknowledgement, from individual achievement to collective responsibility. As cameras flashed and officials applauded, the hunter felt a surge of pride that transcended his discomfort. His daughter had grasped the essential truth of their ordeal, that bearing witness carried an obligation not just to speak but to honor those silenced. Following the formal ceremony, a smaller gathering was held for those directly involved in the investigation and response. The FBI special agent approached the hunter with an expression that suggested additional information beyond what had been publicly disclosed. "The Congressional Committee has completed its classified assessment," the agent said quietly, guiding the hunter to a private corner away from other attendees. "I'm authorized to share certain findings given your central role in the exposure." The hunter waited silently, sensing the weight behind the agent's careful phrasing. The facility's research wasn't isolated. 3 similar operations have been identified in remote wilderness areas across North America, all using the same corporate shell structure, all with similar governmental complicity. The hunter absorbed this information without visible reaction, though its implications sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the Alaskan winter outside. The other sites? Containment teams deployed simultaneously with our operation, all secured within 48 hours. The agent hesitated. "What you discovered wasn't just corporate overreach or environmental crime. The Congressional Committee believes this was phase 1 of a classified program developed outside official channels, a privatized biological modification initiative with potential national security applications. Weapons development, the hunter stated flatly. That classification remains under review. The agent's careful phrasing confirmed the assessment without explicitly acknowledging it. What's certain is that your discovery prevented deployment beyond the testing phase. For that reason, certain aspects of the investigation will remain classified indefinitely. The hunter had suspected as much. The specimens he documented, the research journals, the neurological impact assessments, all suggested applications beyond mere corporate profit or scientific curiosity. Someone had been developing the capacity to modify human populations through environmental exposure, a capability with implications too disturbing to fully contemplate. The survivors? He asked, thinking of the environmental journalist and others held in the facility's lower levels. Receiving specialized care at a secured medical facility. Their conditions are, the agent searched for appropriate terminology, complex. The exposure effects aren't easily reversed, but they're alive and they know their testimony helped bring down the operation that harmed them. Later, as the hunter and his daughter drove back to their hotel, the city lights reflecting off snow-covered streets, he finally verbalized what had been troubling him throughout the ceremonies and acknowledgments. The system failed them, he said quietly. Every level of protection collapsed. Forest Service, environmental oversight, local government, even the FBI's initial assessment, all compromised or circumvented. His daughter considered this, her expression visible in the dashboard lights. True, but the system also ultimately worked, didn't it? Once you provided irrefutable evidence, once you found the right people to listen, the journalist, the EPA contact, the FBI special agent, the response was comprehensive. After decades of operation, after dozens of victims. Yes, she acknowledged, her voice somber. That's why the wilderness needs people like you, people who notice what's wrong, who follow their instincts even when institutions fail. She glanced at him. That's what I want to do with environmental science. Not just study ecosystems, but protect them when protection fails. The hunter felt the weight of the metal in his jacket pocket, a symbol that meant little to him personally, but represented something important to his daughter, and perhaps to others who would hear their story. The truth had emerged, however belatedly. Justice was being implemented, however incompletely, and his daughter had found purpose in their ordeal, a direction that would extend their impact beyond one wilderness, one discovery, one stand against corruption. Perhaps that was recognition enough. Spring came late to the eastern wilderness sector. May brought the first substantial thaw, revealing the forest floor that had lain hidden beneath snow for months. The hunter moved through familiar terrain with a gait slightly altered by his healed ankle. Not quite a limp, but a subtle asymmetry that reminded him with each step of the journey that had transformed his life. The guiding business had resumed operations after a 4-month hiatus. Clients now specifically requested the whistleblower guide, drawn by the notoriety of his discovery but staying for his unparalleled knowledge of the wilderness. Some sought information about the facility and the government response, but most simply wanted to experience the wilderness through the eyes of someone who had defended it when institutions failed. The hunter had established new rules for his guide service, reduced client loads, more selective bookings, and mandatory environmental orientation for all participants. His rates had increased substantially, yet the waiting list extended months into the future. The daughter, now splitting time between university studies and business management, had implemented a scholarship program that allowed local students to experience guided wilderness education at no cost, an initiative funded by the premium rates paid by corporate executives and government officials suddenly eager to demonstrate environmental consciousness. The lab moved ahead along the familiar trail, following the route that led to the clearing where everything had begun 7 months earlier. The dog's movements showed no hesitation now, no reluctance to approach the area that had once triggered such obvious distress. Whatever the animal had sensed in that clearing, the unnatural specimens perhaps, or some residual chemical trace, had evidently dissipated with time and the thorough environmental remediation conducted by federal agencies. The clearing itself had been transformed by the investigation and cleanup. What had been pristine wilderness now showed evidence of intensive scientific activity. Soil sampling patterns, monitoring equipment discreetly placed at the perimeter, subtle markers indicating a site of environmental significance. The container's location remained visible as a slight depression where disturbed soil had settled differently from the surrounding terrain. The hunter stood at the clearing's edge, observing changes beyond those implemented by the remediation teams. The forest itself seemed subtly altered. Vegetation patterns shifted, undergrowth displaying unusual growth characteristics. Bird species normally uncommon in this region now establishing territory. Nothing definitively unnatural, nothing that would alarm casual observers. But to his experienced eye, the ecosystem showed signs of responding to unknown variables. The environmental assessment teams had declared the area fully remediated and biologically stable, but the hunter recognized the limitations of such evaluations. Some changes could not be undone. Some introductions once made became permanent elements of an evolving system. The wilderness would adapt, as it always had, to human interventions, but it would never be precisely what it had been before the facility began its decades of experimentation. The hunter documented these subtle changes in the journal he now maintained for the Environmental Protection Agency's long-term monitoring program. His observations, more detailed and contextual than instrumental readings alone could provide, had become an integral component of the federal oversight established in the wake of the facility's exposure. Twice monthly, he visited designated sites throughout the eastern sector, recording shifts in wildlife behavior, vegetation patterns, and ecosystem interactions that might indicate lingering effects from the biological modifications. As he completed his notes, the hunter noticed something unusual at the base of an ancient spruce tree at the clearing's edge, a small growth unlike the typical fungi or moss that might colonize such locations. Closer inspection revealed what appeared to be a specialized lichen formation with structural properties he'd never encountered in nearly 2 decades of wilderness observation. The hunter photographed the growth from multiple angles, collected a small sample using the EPA-provided kit, and recorded precise GPS coordinates for the monitoring team. His training instructed him to classify such anomalies as Priority 1 observations, requiring immediate laboratory analysis. But he found himself hesitating before applying this designation. The growth showed no signs of aggressive expansion, no evidence of harm to surrounding vegetation. It had established a balanced presence within the ecosystem, neither dominating nor disrupting. Whatever its origin, natural evolution or laboratory intervention, it had found its place in the complex web of wilderness relationships. After careful consideration, the hunter labeled the sample as routine observation, rather than priority alert. The scientist would analyze it regardless, determining its genetic composition and potential relationship to the facility's experiments. But his classification acknowledged something the clinical assessments might miss. The wilderness possessed capacity for integration that transcended human categories of natural versus modified. As dusk approached, the hunter made one final stop on his monitoring route, the ridge overlooking the valley where the research facility had been located. The complex itself had been dismantled under federal supervision, its underground levels filled with specialized containment material, its surface structures completely removed. From his vantage point, no evidence remained of the concrete installation that had been disguised as a natural rock formation for decades. Yet the hunter could still perceive its ghost in the landscape, subtle variations in vegetation where foundations had altered soil composition, drainage patterns changed by years of human intervention. Wildlife movement corridors shifted to avoid the area even months after the facility's removal. The wilderness remembered what had happened here, its memory encoded in ecological relationships rather than written records. The hunter made his final notes as the setting sun painted the valley in amber light. His formal obligation to the monitoring program had been fulfilled, but his responsibility to this wilderness, his wilderness, extended beyond government contracts or official recognition. He would continue watching, documenting, protecting, not because a medal or certificate demanded it, but because 2 decades of relationship with this land had established a covenant that transcended legal designation. As darkness descended, the hunter and the lab began the hike back toward their cabin. Tomorrow would bring new clients eager to experience the wilderness under his guidance. He would show them beauty and resilience, teach them respect and stewardship. But he would not speak of containers buried in remote clearings, of specimens defying natural classification, of facilities hidden beneath manufactured rock faces. Some truths belong to the wilderness itself, to be revealed only to those who earned the land's confidence through years of attentive relationship. The tourists and casual visitors who passed through his territory would see what they came to see: pristine nature, unspoiled wilderness, the Alaska of magazine photographs and travel documentaries. Only the hunter would notice the lichen that shouldn't exist, the bird migrations that followed altered patterns, the subtle genetic signatures that now flowed through watershed and ecosystem like whispered secrets, and he would continue documenting these anomalies, maintaining his vigilance even as official interest inevitably waned with time and shifting priorities. It was, he reflected as the first stars appeared above the spruce canopy, a responsibility he had not sought but could not decline, to be the memory of this wilderness when institutional memories failed, to be its voice when bureaucratic attention turned elsewhere. The lab brushed against his leg, sensing his thoughts as the faithful companion had done through countless hunts and one extraordinary investigation. Together they continued through the gathering darkness, guided by starlight and intimate knowledge of terrain that had become, through 19 years of relationship, an extension of themselves. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge, painting the wilderness in hues of gold and amber, remarkably similar to those that had illuminated the hunter's path 7 months earlier on that fateful October morning. He stood on his cabin porch, coffee steaming in the crisp morning air, watching the familiar transformation of darkness into light. The lab lay at his feet, alert but relaxed, its attention divided between the surrounding forest and the hunter's subtle movements. In the distance, a moose and calf emerged from the tree line to graze in the meadow beyond the property boundary, their movements natural, their forms conforming to evolutionary patterns established over millennia rather than manipulated in underground laboratories. The rhythm of the wilderness continued, as it had long before human intervention and would long after human remediation. The hunter found profound comfort in this continuity, the knowledge that despite temporary corruption, despite institutional failure, despite deliberate manipulation, the fundamental integrity of the natural world endured. His satellite phone chimed with an incoming message, the daughter confirming her weekend visit, sharing news of her university research project examining ecosystem resilience following anthropogenic disturbance. She had transformed their ordeal into academic purpose, leveraging her unique perspective and experience into meaningful contribution to environmental science. The hunter smiled at her message, recognizing that this too represented continuity, not of wilderness itself, but of human stewardship passing between generations. His vigilance would eventually end, but hers was just beginning, informed by both his experience and her formal education. As he prepared for the day's guided expedition, checking equipment and reviewing routes, the hunter reflected on how profoundly his perspective had shifted since discovering that buried container. The wilderness remained beautiful, remained worthy of protection, but no longer appeared pristine or untouched. He now recognized that every ecosystem carried hidden influences, unseen manipulations, stories buried beneath seemingly undisturbed surfaces. This knowledge didn't diminish his connection to the land, but rather deepened it, an understanding that true relationship required seeing both beauty and violation, both resilience and vulnerability. The wilderness didn't need illusory perfection to merit devotion. Its value lay not in immaculate preservation, but in continuous adaptation, in the complex integrity that absorbed human intervention without surrendering essential identity. The hunter shouldered his pack, checked his rifle from habit, though it would remain unused on this observation-focused expedition, and whistled softly to the lab. Together they moved down the familiar trail that led into the heart of their territory, alert to both the expected patterns and the anomalies that might indicate lingering consequences of human interference. The truth of this wilderness, like all fundamental truths, resided not in official reports or committee findings, but in direct observation, in sustained attention, in the willingness to see what actually existed rather than what doctrine claimed should exist. This was the lesson the hunter would pass to his clients today, to his daughter throughout her education, to anyone willing to learn from his experience. Some containers, once discovered, could never be reburied. Some knowledge, once revealed, could never be concealed again. But vigilance, continuous, humble, determined vigilance, could prevent new containers from being hidden, new experiments from proceeding undetected, new corruptions from taking root in institutions designed for protection. And so the hunter continued his path into the wilderness, bearing witness to both its enduring beauty and its subtle transformations, fulfilling a responsibility that had chosen him rather than being chosen. Guardian, guide, whistleblower, titles applied by others that failed to capture the essential truth of his relationship with this land. He was simply one who had seen, one who had spoken, one who continued watching with eyes that could never unsee what that buried container had revealed. The wilderness deserved nothing less. Don't forget to subscribe for more wilderness adventure stories and click the notification bell to be alerted when the next thriller drops.